October 17, 1942. Sachsenhausen concentration camp, 35 kilometers north of Berlin. The morning air carried the smell of wet earth and coal smoke as Karl Hoffmann walked the perimeter path, his boots crunching on gravel that had been raked smooth the night before. He was 43 years old, a reserve policeman from Dresden who had been called to service 7 months earlier. His rifle hung from his shoulder with practiced indifference, the weight so familiar now that he barely noticed it anymore. The camp stretched before him in geometric precision. Rows of wooden barracks arranged in perfect symmetry. Watchtowers at exact intervals. Even the prisoners moved in straight lines during morning assembly, their striped uniforms forming patterns against the gray earth. Order imposed on chaos. Structure built from suffering. Karl had learned not to look too closely at the faces. He had not wanted this assignment. When the mobilization notice arrived at his small apartment in Dresden, he had assumed he would be sent to guard a factory or patrol a railway station. Something mundane. Something that would allow him to serve without having to think too much about what service meant. Instead, they had sent him here. To Sachsenhausen. To the place where the Reich sent those it deemed unworthy of existence. The other guards spoke of the prisoners as cargo. Numbers to be counted and catalogued. Work units to be deployed efficiently. Karl had tried to adopt this language, this distance, but the words felt strange in his mouth. He saw the way prisoners flinched when guards approached. He heard the quiet sounds of weeping from the barracks at night. He smelled the sickness that hung over the infirmary block like a fog. He told himself he was simply following orders. That he had no choice in the matter. That to question was to become suspect oneself. These were the lies men told themselves to sleep at night. Karl told them more convincingly than most. The morning assembly had ended. Prisoners were being marched to their work assignments. Some to the brick factory. Others to the carpentry shop. A group of younger men headed toward the shoe repair commando. Karl watched them file past, their heads down, their movements mechanical. One prisoner stumbled slightly, caught himself, continued walking. No one else seemed to notice. Karl's shift rotation placed him on Tower 7, overlooking the northern section of the camp. It was considered an easy posting. Not much happened in that sector. The serious work, the interrogations, the punishments, the selections, occurred elsewhere. Tower 7 was where guards were sent when superiors wanted them out of the way. Karl had learned to be grateful for obscurity. He climbed the wooden stairs to the tower platform. The guard he was relieving, a younger man named Schmidt, barely acknowledged him. Schmidt descended the stairs quickly, eager to reach the canteen before the morning coffee ran out. Karl settled onto the wooden stool, set his rifle against the railing, and lit a cigarette. From this height, the camp revealed its true dimensions. 20,000 prisoners at last count. Perhaps more now. The numbers changed weekly as transports arrived and departed. The smoke from the crematorium hung low over the eastern section, a gray ribbon against the October sky. Karl had stopped wondering what the smoke meant. Some questions were better left unasked. His eyes moved across the compound with practiced efficiency. The labor columns had departed. The main yard was empty except for a few prisoners sweeping the parade ground. Everything appeared normal. Normal, in this context, meant orderly. It meant no one was running. No one was screaming. The violence was organized, scheduled, predictable. He remembered his first week. The shock of it. The casual cruelty that guards displayed as easily as breathing. The way senior officers spoke of efficiency quotas and processing rates while standing in front of starving men. He had vomited twice that first week. Behind the barracks where no one could see. By the second week, his stomach had hardened. By the third week, he could eat lunch after witnessing a beating. The human capacity for adaptation was remarkable. But something else had happened during those early weeks. Something Karl did not discuss with the other guards. He had begun to notice the small acts of resistance that prisoners performed when they thought no one was watching. The way one man would slip a piece of bread to another. The whispered words of encouragement exchanged during roll call. The prisoners who risked punishment to help a comrade who had fallen. These moments were brief, almost invisible, but they happened with surprising frequency. And Karl had begun to pretend not to see them. It started without conscious decision. A prisoner lingering too long at the wash basin. Karl looked away. Two prisoners sharing a cigarette stub during the work break. Karl examined his rifle. A man slipping into the latrine outside his assigned time. Karl studied the clouds. These were minor infractions. Barely worth reporting. But in Sachsenhausen, any infraction could become an excuse for punishment. Karl's deliberate blindness was a small thing. Insignificant in the vast machinery of the camp. But to the prisoners who benefited from it, those moments of unseen kindness meant something. They meant survival. They meant a few extra calories. A moment of rest. A whispered message delivered. The accumulation of small mercies that made the difference between endurance and collapse. He did not think of himself as heroic. He was simply a man who had learned to look away at strategic moments. But in a place designed to see everything, to control everything, even the act of not seeing became a form of resistance. The sun climbed higher. The morning passed. Karl smoked another cigarette and watched the camp with eyes that had learned the art of selective vision. November 3, 1942. The temperature had dropped overnight. Frost covered the parade ground, turning the dirt into hard, uneven terrain. Karl stood at his post on Tower 7, his breath visible in the cold air, watching the prisoners assemble for morning roll call. They stood in perfect rows, thousands of men in striped uniforms, their faces blank, their bodies rigid with practiced discipline. The roll call lasted 2 hours. Sometimes longer. The camp administration used it as a tool of control. Make them stand until they collapse. Make them wait until they understand that time itself belongs to the Reich. Karl had witnessed prisoners die during roll call. From cold. From exhaustion. From the simple act of standing too long while their bodies gave out. Today the roll call ended without incident. The prisoners dispersed to their work assignments. Karl's shift was nearly over when he noticed movement near the eastern barracks. A prisoner had broken formation, was moving toward the latrine block. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the man's speed. He was running. Running was forbidden. Running suggested escape. Running brought immediate response. Karl raised his rifle, tracking the man through the sight. The prisoner was young, perhaps 20 years old, wearing the red triangle of a political prisoner. He reached the latrine and disappeared inside. Karl kept his rifle raised. Other guards had noticed. Shouts echoed across the compound. An officer was running toward the latrine, his pistol drawn. Karl should have fired. That was the protocol. A prisoner running without permission was attempting escape. The standing order was clear. Shoot first. Questions later. But something made Karl hesitate. The man had run to the latrine. Not toward the fence. Not toward the gate. He had run to the latrine as though his life depended on reaching it quickly. The officer reached the latrine entrance. Pulled his pistol. Entered. Karl waited, his finger on the trigger, his heart beating faster than it should. 30 seconds passed. The officer emerged, holstering his weapon. He looked around, found Karl's tower, and shouted up. False alarm. The fool has dysentery. Couldn't make it to the trench in time. Karl lowered his rifle. The other guards relaxed. The moment passed. But Karl understood what had happened. The prisoner's desperate run had not been an escape attempt. It had been something more basic, more human. The man had been sick. Violently sick. And he had chosen to risk being shot rather than soil himself in front of the assembled camp. Karl had not fired. He had waited those crucial seconds before pulling the trigger. Had given the officer time to investigate. Had allowed for the possibility that there might be an explanation beyond attempted escape. It was a small decision. A brief hesitation. But it had saved a man's life. That evening, as Karl walked back to his barracks, he passed the infirmary. The prisoner with dysentery was there, receiving treatment. He would live. Would return to work in a few days. Would continue the impossible task of surviving Sachsenhausen. Because one guard had hesitated. Because one guard had waited 3 seconds before shooting. The other guards discussed the incident over dinner. Most agreed Karl should have fired immediately. The prisoner was lucky, they said. Next time, don't wait. Next time, follow protocol. Karl nodded, said nothing, ate his food. But he knew something had changed. The act of not shooting had been intentional. He had chosen to wait. Had chosen to give the man a chance. And that choice, however small, had created a crack in the armor he had built around himself. The days grew shorter. Winter approached. The camp became a place of frozen mud and bitter wind. Prisoners died in larger numbers. Cold took those who might have survived summer. Karl watched it happen from Tower 7. Watched the bodies being carried to the crematorium. Watched the smoke rise into the gray sky. But he also began to watch for other things. Opportunities to look away. Moments when his selective blindness might matter. He developed a system. A method of being present without truly seeing. He would stand at his post, rifle ready, eyes scanning the compound, but his focus would deliberately skip over certain areas. The shadows behind the carpentry shop where prisoners traded contraband. The space between barracks 14 and 15 where messages were passed. The corner of the exercise yard where sick prisoners rested when they should have been working. These blind spots in his vision became a map of small mercies. Other prisoners began to notice. Not consciously. Not openly. But word spread in the way it always spread in camps. Through whispers and glances and careful observation. Tower 7, they learned, was safer than other towers. The guard there did not report every infraction. Did not shoot at every movement. Gave warnings instead of punishments when possible. Karl never spoke to prisoners directly. That would have been too dangerous. Too obvious. Instead, he communicated through absence. Through the things he did not see. Through the reports he did not file. His resistance was passive, invisible, deniable. If questioned, he could claim oversight. Fatigue. Distraction. The camp was large. One guard could not see everything. These excuses protected him while allowing the small acts of mercy to continue. December arrived. With it came a new commandant. A man with a reputation for efficiency. For running camps that met their quotas and exceeded expectations. Karl heard the guards talking. This new commandant would not tolerate slack discipline. Would not accept excuses. Would demand absolute adherence to protocol. Karl understood what this meant. His careful system of looking away would become more dangerous. More difficult to maintain. But he also understood that it would become more necessary. Under a harsher regime, the prisoners would need those small mercies even more desperately. On December 8, during the first inspection by the new commandant, Karl stood at attention in Tower 7 while the officer examined his post. The commandant reviewed the logbook. Asked about incidents. Questioned why there had been so few reports of infractions from this section. Karl explained that the northern sector was quiet. That the prisoners assigned to work details in this area were generally compliant. That he maintained vigilance but found little to report. The commandant studied him for a long moment. Karl felt the weight of that gaze. Felt the assessment happening behind those cold eyes. Finally, the commandant nodded. Maintain your vigilance, Hoffmann. I expect detailed reports from all towers. Even quiet sectors have problems if one looks carefully enough. Yes, Herr Commandant. The inspection moved on. Karl exhaled slowly. The message had been clear. Look harder. Report more. Tighten discipline. But Karl had also heard what was not said. The commandant had not removed him from his post. Had not questioned his record directly. Had simply issued a warning. Which meant Karl still had room to maneuver. Still had space to maintain his carefully calibrated blindness. That night, lying in his bunk, Karl wondered how long he could continue this delicate balance. How many times he could look away before someone noticed. How many prisoners he might save through the simple act of pretending not to see. The numbers would never be large. His impact would never be significant in any measurable way. But to the man with dysentery who had not been shot, the significance was absolute. Karl closed his eyes. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen camp. The crematorium smoke rose into darkness. And somewhere in the barracks, prisoners who had received small mercies that day settled into their bunks with fractionally more hope than they had woken with. Small mercies. Invisible resistance. The guard who pretended not to see. January 12, 1943. The coldest winter in 20 years. Prisoners died from exposure at a rate that strained even the crematorium's capacity. The morning roll call claimed 3 men who simply froze while standing in formation. Their bodies remained upright for several seconds after death before finally collapsing into the frost-covered dirt. Karl had been assigned additional duties. The new commandant's efficiency drive meant longer shifts, more inspections, stricter accountability. Tower 7's quiet sector was no longer quite so quiet. Guards were rotated more frequently. Logbooks were examined daily. Every prisoner movement had to be documented and justified. But Karl had learned adaptation. He filed reports now, detailed ones, listing minor infractions that justified his vigilance without requiring serious punishment. A prisoner coughing during assembly. Another with improperly tied shoes. Small violations that could be noted without triggering beatings or worse. The commandant seemed satisfied. Karl was demonstrating proper attention to detail. What the commandant could not see was the careful selection process behind those reports. Karl documented the infractions that mattered least. The visible ones. The harmless ones. While allowing the significant violations to slip past unnoticed. A prisoner stealing extra bread. Another passing a forbidden letter. A third disappearing into the shadows for a few minutes of unauthorized rest. These infractions went unrecorded. Unseen. Protected by Karl's deliberate blindness. The system worked until the bread incident. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Work Detail 4-7 was marching past Tower 7, heading to the brick factory. 42 prisoners in 2 columns, supervised by a capo with a club and a guard with a rifle. Standard procedure. The column moved in mechanical precision. No one spoke. No one looked up. Except for prisoner 38814. A Polish man in his 30s, assigned to the brick factory commando for 8 months. Karl had noticed him before. Not because of any particular characteristic, but because 38814 was one of those prisoners who seemed to understand the invisible rules. Who moved through the camp with careful awareness of what could be seen and what could not. 38,814's hand moved quickly. A piece of bread appeared from somewhere inside his uniform, was passed to the prisoner beside him. The transfer took less than 2 seconds. Most guards would have missed it. But Karl's position in the tower gave him a direct line of sight. He saw the entire transaction clearly. Protocol demanded immediate action. Sharing food between prisoners was strictly forbidden. Both men should be pulled from formation, interrogated, punished. The bread should be confiscated. A report filed. Karl had his rifle. Had his whistle. Had his authority. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, looking through the sight directly at prisoner 38814. The prisoner felt the attention. Karl saw the man's shoulders tense. Saw the slight acceleration in his pace. Saw the fear that came from knowing he had been observed breaking a rule. The column continued marching. The moment stretched. Karl's finger rested on the trigger guard. And then Karl lowered the rifle. Turned his attention to a different section of the compound. Lit a cigarette with hands that were steadier than they should have been. Let the column march past without incident. It was the most dangerous thing he had done yet. The capo might have seen the bread transfer. The other guard might have noticed. Any prisoner in the column could report what had happened, hoping to gain favor by exposing a guard's negligence. But Karl had calculated the risks. The capo was lazy, more interested in avoiding work than enforcing rules. The other guard was half-blind from untreated syphilis. And the prisoners understood that reporting a guard's mercy would only result in harsher treatment for everyone. Still, Karl spent the rest of his shift waiting for consequences. For the commandant to appear. For accusations. For the carefully built structure of his invisible resistance to collapse. But nothing happened. The shift ended. He was relieved by the next guard. He walked back to his barracks through the frozen compound, his boots crunching on ice, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. That night, he couldn't sleep. Kept replaying the moment in his mind. The bread passing from hand to hand. His rifle raised. His choice to look away. Each replay brought the same question: How many times could he make that choice before the consequences found him? 3 days later, during the evening meal in the guard's canteen, Karl heard rumors. A prisoner in the brick factory had been beaten for possessing contraband bread. The capo had found it during a random search. The prisoner had died from his injuries. Karl felt his stomach tighten. Was it prisoner 38,814? Had his mercy that day simply delayed the inevitable? He asked carefully. Tried to sound casual. Learned that it was a different prisoner. Different commando. Nothing to do with the incident at Tower 7. Karl felt relief, followed immediately by guilt. One man dead. Another temporarily spared. What kind of mathematics was this? What kind of moral calculus reduced human lives to probability and chance? But he also understood something else. The bread that prisoner 38814 had passed to his companion might have been the difference between survival and death for someone. Might have provided just enough calories to endure another day. Might have meant the difference between freezing and making it through the night. Karl's choice to look away had created that possibility. Had allowed that small mercy to occur. The winter deepened. More prisoners died. Karl continued his careful system of selective vision. The bread incident became one of dozens of similar moments. A stolen potato. A forbidden conversation. A moment of rest taken when work should have been done. Each time, Karl had to choose. Each time, he chose to pretend not to see. And each time, he wondered how long his luck would hold. February 1943. A transport arrived from the Warsaw Ghetto. Among the hundreds of prisoners were families. Women and children mixed with the usual influx of political prisoners and resistance fighters. This was unusual. Sachsenhausen was not typically a family camp. The presence of children suggested something had changed in the Reich's deportation policies. Karl watched the processing from Tower 7. Saw the families separated. Men to one side. Women and children to another. The children were quiet. Too quiet. They had learned already that silence meant survival. Their faces held an emptiness that no child should know. Most of the children were sent immediately to the women's barracks. A temporary arrangement, the guard said. They would be transferred to other facilities soon. Karl did not ask what kind of facilities. He had learned that some questions could only lead to answers he did not want to hear. But 3 children were not sent with the others. 3 boys, ages perhaps 10 to 12, were assigned to light labor duties. This was against regulations. Children were not supposed to be given work assignments. But regulations bent easily under the pressure of quotas and efficiency demands. 3 more workers meant 3 more units of productivity. The commandant approved the assignment. The youngest of the 3 was named Jacob. Karl learned this because he heard the capo shouting it across the compound. Jacob, move faster. Jacob, carry this. Jacob, stop your crying. The boy worked in the carpentry shop commando, which passed beneath Tower 7 twice daily. Morning and evening. Regular as clockwork. Jacob was small for his age. Malnourished. His striped uniform hung loosely on a frame that seemed to be composed entirely of bones and will. But he worked without complaint. Carried boards that looked too heavy for him. Fetched tools when ordered. Kept his head down and his mouth shut. Karl tried not to watch. Tried to maintain the professional distance that made this job bearable. Children were harder. Children broke through the armor more easily than adults. Their suffering was more difficult to rationalize. More difficult to ignore. On Jacob's 3rd day in the carpentry commando, it snowed. Heavy, wet snow that turned the camp into a treacherous landscape of ice and mud. The work details marched out as usual. The Reich's productivity could not be slowed by weather. Jacob marched with his commando, his thin uniform providing no protection against the cold. His lips were blue. His hands shook. But he marched. Karl watched from the tower, his own hands warm in regulation gloves, his own body protected by a heavy coat. The inequality of it struck him with unusual force. He was warm because he wore the right uniform. Jacob was freezing because he wore the wrong one. The arbitrary nature of suffering reduced to symbols and colors. The carpentry commando worked through the morning. At midday, they were marched back past Tower 7 for the lunch distribution. Jacob stumbled. Fell into the snow. Struggled to stand. The capo raised his club, ready to beat the boy for breaking formation. Karl acted without thinking. Shouted down from the tower. "You there! Capo! The commandant wants better discipline in the columns. See that they march properly. No beating necessary if they maintain formation." It was a lie. The commandant had said no such thing. But the capo hesitated. Karl's rank was higher. His authority unquestionable. The capo lowered the club. Kicked Jacob instead, but not hard. Just enough to encourage the boy to stand. Jacob scrambled to his feet. The column continued moving. Karl had just crossed another line. Had intervened directly. Had used his authority to prevent a beating. This was more dangerous than simply looking away. This was active participation. Active protection. But watching the club raised above a child's head had triggered something in him that could not be suppressed. That night, Karl lay in his bunk and thought about his own son. Peter was 14 now, safe in Dresden with Karl's wife. Probably doing homework. Probably complaining about school. Probably taking for granted the warmth and safety that Jacob could not even imagine. The contrast was unbearable. The next morning, Karl was reassigned. Called to the commandant's office. His heart hammered as he walked across the compound. This was it. Someone had reported his intervention. The capo. Another guard. Perhaps even a prisoner seeking favor. His career of small mercies was ending. But the commandant wanted to discuss a different matter entirely. Guard rotations were changing. Karl was being moved to the night shift for 2 weeks. Different hours. Different responsibilities. Nothing about yesterday's incident. Karl accepted the new assignment, left the office, exhaled. The night shift changed everything. Tower 7 at night was quieter. Darker. The searchlight swept across the compound in predictable patterns, leaving pools of shadow where prisoners could move unseen. Karl learned the rhythm of the lights. Learned where the shadows fell deepest. And he began to leave those shadows unexamined. Jacob survived his first month in the carpentry commando. Karl watched the boy's resilience with something approaching wonder. Children possessed a capacity for endurance that adults often lacked. They bent without breaking. Adapted without losing some essential core of themselves. Jacob learned to avoid the capo's notice. Learned which guards were dangerous and which could be approached. Learned the invisible rules that govern survival. And Jacob learned that the guard in Tower 7 sometimes looked away at crucial moments. Karl never spoke to the boy. Never acknowledged his presence directly. But their relationship existed nonetheless. Built from glances and timing and the careful choreography of mercy. When Jacob needed to rest, he did so in the blind spot behind the lumber pile. When he needed to salvage a piece of discarded bread, he did so during the moment when Karl was examining the eastern perimeter. Small moments. Invisible assistance. The guard who pretended not to see. March arrived. The snow began to melt. Jacob had been in the camp for 6 weeks. A miracle of endurance. But Karl had heard rumors. The children who had been sent to the women's barracks were being transferred. Not to other camps. To somewhere else. The guards did not use the word, but Karl understood the implication. The children were being sent to die. Jacob was still in the carpentry commando. Still working. Still surviving. But for how long? How long before some administrator decided that children did not belong in Sachsenhausen? How long before the transfer order came? Karl could not save everyone. Could not even save most. His small acts of mercy amounted to almost nothing against the vast machinery of destruction. But he could save this one boy. For as long as possible. Through careful blindness and strategic intervention and the accumulated weight of tiny decisions that added up to continued existence. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was what he could do. And so he did it. April 15, 1943. Spring arrived with unexpected warmth. The frozen ground thawed. Mud replaced ice. The smell of decay rose from the earth as winter's casualties were revealed. Bodies that had been buried in shallow graves. Waste that had been frozen in place. The camp stank of death and decomposition. But the warmer weather also meant better survival rates. Fewer prisoners died from exposure. Work became easier when fingers could grip tools without going numb. The daily death toll, while still horrific, decreased slightly. Karl tracked these changes from Tower 7, noting the subtle shifts in the camp's brutal mathematics. Jacob was still alive. Still in the carpentry commando. The boy had developed a cough that worried Karl. A wet, rattling sound that suggested lung damage or disease. But Jacob continued working. Continued surviving. The cough became just another element of the camp's soundtrack. Like the sound of boots on gravel. Like the crackle of searchlights. Like the low murmur of prisoners' voices during evening assembly. Karl had been on the night shift for 6 weeks now. His internal clock had adjusted to the inverted schedule. Sleep during the day. Work through darkness. The night hours brought different challenges. Less visibility. More opportunities for prisoners to attempt escape. More reason for guards to be vigilant. But also more shadows. More places where Karl's selective blindness could operate. Other guards had begun to notice his patterns. Not overtly. Not with accusations. But Karl felt their attention. The way they watched him during briefings. The questions they asked about his sector. The subtle probing to understand why Tower 7 reported so few incidents. On the night of April 15, Karl's careful system finally collapsed. It started with a prisoner named Dietrich. A German political prisoner who had been in Sachsenhausen for 2 years. Dietrich worked in the carpentry shop, the same commando as Jacob. He was a skilled craftsman, valuable enough that the camp administration kept him alive despite his political designation. But Dietrich had made a mistake. Had been caught with contraband tools. Had been scheduled for punishment. The punishment was set for midnight. Public beating in the main yard. 25 lashes. Standard procedure for theft of camp property. Dietrich would survive if he was lucky. The capo delivering the beating would be careful not to kill him. Valuable workers deserved careful beatings. But survival would mean weeks of recovery. Infection. Weakness. The kind of injury that often led to death from secondary complications. Karl watched the preparations from Tower 7. Saw the posts being set up in the yard. Saw Dietrich being led from the punishment block. Saw the other guards gathering to witness. This was entertainment for them. A break in the monotony of night duty. Dietrich was stripped to the waist. Tied to the posts. The capo raised the whip. Brought it down. The crack echoed across the compound. Dietrich's back split open. Blood appeared in a dark line across his skin. Second strike. Third. Fourth. Dietrich made no sound. Refused to give them the satisfaction. The beating continued with mechanical precision. Each strike landing with practiced accuracy. Each impact producing another line of torn flesh. At the 12th strike, Jacob appeared. The boy came running from the direction of the barracks. His small figure moving through the shadows with desperate speed. He was running toward the yard. Toward Dietrich. Karl saw him and understood immediately what was happening. Jacob was going to try to stop the beating. Was going to sacrifice himself to save a friend. Children possessed a moral clarity that adults had learned to suppress. They saw injustice and responded without calculating consequences. Jacob saw a man being beaten and could not stay silent. Could not remain hidden. Had to act. Karl knew what would happen. The guards would grab Jacob. Would punish him for interfering. Might beat him. Might kill him. The commandant's tolerance for disruption was zero. A child interrupting a sanctioned punishment would be made an example. The lesson would be permanent. Karl did not hesitate. He raised his rifle. Shouted across the compound. Escaped prisoner. Northeast sector. Movement near the fence. It was a complete fabrication. A lie shouted loud enough to be heard by every guard in the yard. The effect was immediate. The beating stopped. Guards turned toward the northeast fence. Searchlights swiveled. The camp sirens began to wail. In the confusion, Jacob stopped running. Froze in the shadows between barracks. Smart enough to understand that the diversion had been created for him. Smart enough to disappear. Karl kept shouting. Kept pointing toward the fabricated escape attempt. Other guards were running now. Moving toward the fence. Looking for the prisoner who did not exist. The yard cleared. Only Dietrich remained, still tied to the posts, his back a mass of bloodied flesh. It took 5 minutes for the guards to realize the alarm was false. No prisoner at the fence. No evidence of escape. Karl, when questioned, claimed he had seen movement. Must have been a shadow. Perhaps an animal. The darkness played tricks. He apologized for the false alarm. The commandant was furious. Appeared in the yard in his nightclothes, demanding explanations. Why had Hoffmann raised a false alarm? Why had he disrupted a sanctioned punishment? What exactly had he seen? Karl repeated his story. Shadow. Movement. Darkness. Mistake. He maintained calm. Showed proper contrition. The commandant stared at him with those cold eyes. Evaluating. Calculating. Deciding. You have wasted time and resources, Hoffmann. Creating panic over shadows. This is unacceptable. Yes, Herr Commandant. My apologies. You are relieved of duty. Report to my office in the morning. Yes, Herr Commandant. Karl descended from Tower 7. Walked across the compound to the guards' barracks. Behind him, the beating of Dietrich resumed. The capo completed the remaining 13 strikes with renewed vigor, angry at the interruption. Dietrich's screams finally broke through his silence. The sound followed Karl all the way to his bunk. He lay in the darkness, knowing he had crossed the final line. The commandant was not stupid. Would realize that the false alarm had been timed too perfectly. Would understand that someone had intervened to protect someone. The question was whether the commandant could prove it. Whether he would choose to pursue it. Whether Karl's years of careful service would buy him any mercy. Sleep did not come. Karl lay awake, listening to the sounds of the camp at night. The distant rumble of machinery. The barking of dogs. The occasional shout of a guard on patrol. And somewhere in the barracks, Jacob was alive. Hidden. Protected by a lie shouted across a compound at midnight. Morning came too quickly. Karl reported to the commandant's office at 0800. Stood at attention while the commandant reviewed papers on his desk. The silence stretched. Finally, the commandant looked up. You have served adequately for 18 months, Hoffmann. Your record shows no major incidents. Your reports have been detailed and professional. But last night's error is concerning. It suggests deteriorating attention to detail. Perhaps you are suffering from fatigue. From the strain of night duty. I take full responsibility, Herr Commandant. I am reassigning you to the day shift. Tower 4. Different sector. Different responsibilities. Consider this a fresh start. Do not waste it. Thank you, Herr Commandant. Karl was dismissed. Walked out of the office into the morning sunlight. He had been spared. Reassigned rather than punished. The commandant had either chosen to accept Karl's explanation or had decided that pursuing the matter was not worth the administrative effort. Either way, Karl remained a guard. Remained free. Remained able to continue his careful resistance. But he also understood that his room for error had disappeared. The next mistake would not be forgiven. The next intervention would end his career. Possibly his freedom. Possibly his life. Tower 4 overlooked a different section of camp. The punishment block. The interrogation rooms. The places where serious violations were handled. Karl's new assignment was deliberate. The commandant was testing him. Placing him where mercy would be most difficult to extend. Where looking away would be most dangerous. Karl accepted the assignment without complaint. Learned the routines of his new post. Discovered that Tower 4 offered fewer opportunities for blindness and more occasions for mandatory observation. But he also discovered that even here, in the darkest section of the camp, small mercies were still possible. A report delayed by a few hours. A guard called away at a crucial moment. A searchlight aimed slightly wrong. The methods changed. The locations changed. But the essential act remained the same. Karl continued to pretend not to see. Continued to create small spaces where prisoners could breathe. Continued the invisible resistance that had become his only defense against complicity. Jacob survived. Dietrich survived. Spring deepened. And Karl kept his post in Tower 4, learning the new geography of mercy in a place designed to eliminate it. June 1943. Summer brought heat and dust. The camp became an oven. Prisoners worked under a sun that offered no mercy. Water rations were reduced. Productivity quotas increased. More prisoners died from heatstroke and dehydration than had died from cold during winter. Karl had adapted to Tower 4. The assignment was brutal. Every day brought new horrors that he was required to witness. Beatings. Interrogations. Executions. The camp's machinery of violence operated with industrial efficiency, and Karl's tower provided a viewing platform for all of it. He learned to compartmentalize. To separate the witnessing from the feeling. To observe without internalizing. These were survival skills for guards just as much as for prisoners. The alternative was madness. Or desertion. Or a bullet through one's own skull. Karl had seen guards choose all three options. But compartmentalization had costs. Karl felt himself becoming numb. Felt the erosion of whatever moral core had prompted his earlier acts of mercy. The daily exposure to suffering was wearing him down. Making him into the thing he had tried not to become. Just another guard. Just another cog in the machine. Then he witnessed something that broke through the numbness. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. A transport had arrived that morning. Political prisoners from France. Resistance members who had been captured during raids on underground networks. Among them was a woman named Marie. Karl learned her name because the guards discussed her with particular interest. She was young. Attractive. The kind of prisoner that drew unwanted attention. Marie was sent to the women's block. But she was also scheduled for interrogation. The Gestapo officers wanted information about resistance networks in Paris. About supply routes. About safe houses. About names and locations and connections. Marie, they believed, could provide valuable intelligence. The interrogation took place in a building directly below Tower 4. Karl could not see inside. But he could hear. The walls were thin. Sound carried. He heard the questions. Heard Marie's refusals. Heard the escalation. They beat her for 3 hours. Karl heard every blow. Heard her cries. Heard the moments when the beating stopped and the questions resumed. Heard her continued refusals. The woman possessed extraordinary courage. Extraordinary determination. Even when the pain must have been unbearable, she gave them nothing. Finally, the interrogation ended. Marie was dragged from the building, barely conscious, her face bloodied, her uniform torn. 2 guards carried her back toward the women's block. She would be allowed to recover. Then they would try again. The Gestapo had time. Had tools. Had methods that broke even the strongest will eventually. Karl watched them carry her across the compound. Watched her head lolling against her chest. Watched the blood dripping from her mouth onto the dusty ground. Something in him broke. Or perhaps something in him was restored. He could not remain numb to this. Could not witness this and maintain his careful distance. That night, Karl did something unprecedented. He wrote a letter. Not to the commandant. Not to his superiors. But to a contact in Berlin. A man he had known before the war. A lawyer with connections in the justice ministry. Karl described what he had witnessed. Described the interrogation of Marie. Described the conditions in Sachsenhausen. He did not mention his own acts of mercy. Only what he had seen done to others. The letter was dangerous. If discovered, it would mean execution. Writing to external authorities about camp conditions was considered treasonous. But Karl sealed the letter, waited for his next leave, and mailed it from a post office in Berlin. He did not expect anything to come of it. But he needed to do something. Needed to create some record of what was happening. Some evidence that would survive even if he did not. 3 weeks later, an inspector arrived at Sachsenhausen. Not from the Justice Ministry. From the SS Central Administration. The inspector's official purpose was routine oversight. But Karl recognized the coincidence. His letter had prompted attention. Someone had decided to investigate. The inspection lasted 2 days. The inspector examined facilities. Reviewed documentation. Interviewed guards and prisoners. Karl was questioned along with everyone else. Did he have complaints about camp administration? Had he witnessed irregularities? Did he have information about prisoner treatment? Karl said nothing. Claimed everything was in order. The inspector took notes. Made no accusations. Left after completing his review. Karl waited for consequences that never came. Either the inspection had revealed nothing actionable, or the SS had decided that Sachsenhausen's efficiency outweighed any concerns about methods. But the inspection had an effect nonetheless. For 2 weeks after the inspector's departure, interrogations were suspended. Punishment beatings were reduced. Rations were slightly increased. The camp administration was nervous. Uncertain whether they were being watched. Uncertain whether Berlin was paying attention. Marie recovered during this period. Her wounds healed. Her strength returned. And when interrogations resumed, she continued to refuse. Continued to protect her comrades in France. The Gestapo eventually gave up. Sent her to regular work assignments. She had won through sheer endurance. Through refusal to break. Through courage that Karl could only witness and admire. Jacob was still alive. Still in the carpentry commando. The boy had survived for 5 months. An impossible duration for a child in Sachsenhausen. Karl understood that Jacob's survival was not due to his own interventions alone. The boy possessed his own resourcefulness. His own determination. His own network of protection among other prisoners. Karl's small mercies had helped. But Jacob's survival was ultimately Jacob's own achievement. August arrived. Karl received news from Dresden. His son Peter had been drafted. Would be sent to the Eastern Front after basic training. The news hit Karl with unexpected force. His own son would now participate in this war. Would now be exposed to the same machinery of violence that Karl witnessed daily. The war that had seemed distant and abstract had suddenly become personal in a new way. Karl tried to imagine Peter in combat. Tried to imagine his 14-year-old son carrying a rifle. Killing. Being killed. The images would not form. His mind rejected them. But the possibility remained. Peter would go east. Would fight. Would experience whatever horrors awaited young soldiers in that vast battlefield. That night, Karl looked at the prisoners in the compound with different eyes. Saw them as someone's sons. Someone's brothers. Someone's fathers. The abstraction that had allowed him to function as a guard dissolved. These were not numbers. Not units. Not cargo. They were men with families. With people who loved them. With mothers who worried. With children who waited. The revelation should have made his job impossible. Should have forced him to resign. To desert. To refuse participation. But Karl understood that his departure would not save anyone. Would only result in his replacement by someone less willing to look away. His continued presence, his continued small mercies, mattered more than his moral comfort. So he remained. Stood his post in Tower 4. Witnessed the daily horrors. And continued to pretend not to see when opportunities for mercy appeared. The numbness was gone. The compartmentalization had failed. He felt everything now. Every beating. Every death. Every moment of suffering. But feeling it did not paralyze him. Instead, it sharpened his determination to create whatever small spaces for humanity he could manage. September came. Autumn approached. Karl had been a guard at Sachsenhausen for 19 months. Had witnessed thousands of deaths. Had failed to save thousands more. but had also created moments of mercy that accumulated into something that might, if he allowed himself to believe it, be called resistance. November 1943. Rumors spread through the camp. The war was turning. Allied forces had landed in Italy. The Wehrmacht was retreating on the Eastern Front. For the first time, prisoners began to whisper about the possibility of liberation. About the war ending. About surviving to see freedom. Karl heard these whispers during his rounds. Heard the hope in prisoners' voices. And he felt a complicated mix of emotions. Hope that the war might end. Fear of what defeat would mean for Germany. Uncertainty about what liberation would mean for him. He was a guard. Had served the Reich. Had participated in the camp system even if he had tried to resist from within. Would the liberators make distinctions? Would they care that he had looked away? That he had created small mercies? Or would they see only the uniform he wore? The position he had held? But liberation remained distant. The rumors, while based on real military developments, did not translate into imminent freedom for Sachsenhausen. The camp continued operating with brutal efficiency. Prisoners continued dying. The machinery of destruction showed no signs of slowing. In December, Jacob disappeared. Karl noticed his absence during the morning roll call. The carpentry commando assembled without the small figure who had become a familiar presence. Karl asked carefully. Learned that Jacob had been transferred. Not to another camp. To the infirmary. The boy had finally succumbed to the cough that had plagued him for months. Pneumonia. His lungs had filled with fluid. His weakened body could not fight the infection. Karl went to the infirmary during his break. Found Jacob in a bed near the back. The boy's breathing was labored. His skin had a gray pallor. The camp doctor had given him basic treatment. Some aspirin. A thin blanket. But no antibiotics. No real medicine. Resources were reserved for guards and essential prisoners. A child had no priority. Karl stood beside the bed, looking down at Jacob. The boy's eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell with difficulty. Each breath seemed to require enormous effort. Karl wanted to do something. Wanted to find medicine. Wanted to save this one child who had survived so long against impossible odds. But there was nothing he could do. He was a guard, not a doctor. Had no access to medical supplies. Had no authority to demand treatment. His power extended only to small mercies. To moments of looking away. He could not cure pneumonia with selective blindness. Jacob died 3 days later. Died quietly in the night while Karl was on duty in Tower 4. The body was removed in the morning. Taken to the crematorium. Reduced to ash and smoke like thousands before him. Karl felt the death as a personal failure. He had protected Jacob for 5 months. Had created space for the boy to survive. But ultimately it had not been enough. The camp's machinery had claimed Jacob anyway. Through disease rather than violence, but claimed him nonetheless. The grief Karl felt surprised him. He had witnessed thousands of deaths. Had become practiced at emotional distance. But Jacob's death broke through those defenses. Perhaps because Karl had known the boy's name. Had watched him work and struggle and survive. Had invested something of himself in the child's continued existence. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was just that watching a child die from treatable illness while possessing no power to help was a special kind of torture. A reminder that all his small mercies, all his acts of invisible resistance, amounted to almost nothing against the vast machinery of death. Karl requested a 3-day leave. It was granted. He traveled to Dresden. Visited his wife and son. Peter was preparing for military training. Excited and nervous about his upcoming deployment. Karl's wife asked about his work. Karl said it was fine. Said he was managing guard duty at a labor camp. Said nothing about what he actually witnessed. He spent the 3 days in a kind of fog. Present but not fully engaged. His mind kept returning to Sachsenhausen. To Jacob. To all the deaths he had witnessed and failed to prevent. His family noticed his distance but attributed it to war stress. To the burden of service. They had no way to understand the specific weight he carried. When Karl returned to Sachsenhausen, winter had arrived in earnest. The camp was once again a landscape of frozen mud and bitter cold. Prisoners huddled in their thin uniforms. The daily death toll increased. Everything seemed to be repeating. The cycle of suffering continuing without end. But something had changed in Karl. Jacob's death had crystallized something. Had forced him to recognize the limits of his resistance. He could not save everyone. Could not prevent the camp from claiming those it wanted. His small mercies helped, but they were not enough. Would never be enough. The question was whether they still mattered. Whether creating moments of mercy in a system designed to eliminate mercy had any value. Whether the guard who pretended not to see was any different from the guards who saw everything and participated without hesitation. Karl did not have answers. Only questions. And the daily choice to continue his careful acts of blindness. To keep creating small spaces where prisoners could breathe. To maintain his invisible resistance even when its impact seemed negligible. January 1944 arrived. Karl had been a guard at Sachsenhausen for 2 years. 2 years of witnessing. 2 years of small mercies. 2 years of moral compromise and impossible choices. The war continued. The camp continued. And Karl continued to stand in his tower, watching and not watching, seeing and pretending not to see. April 1945. The sound of artillery fire could be heard in the distance. Soviet forces were approaching. The Third Reich was collapsing. Liberation was finally, truly imminent. But liberation meant different things to different people. For prisoners, it meant survival might finally have purpose. Meant the machinery of death would stop. Meant going home, or at least leaving this place of organized suffering. For guards, liberation meant uncertainty. Meant reckoning. Meant facing justice for participation in the system they had served. The camp administration began destroying evidence. Documents were burned. Prisoner records disappeared. The crematorium worked overtime, burning not just bodies but also any physical evidence of what had happened here. The commandant issued orders for evacuation. Prisoners were to be marched west, away from the advancing Soviets. Those too weak to march would be left behind. Karl received different orders. As a German police officer rather than SS, he was not required to participate in the evacuation. He could return to Dresden. Could attempt to disappear into civilian life before the Soviets arrived. Many guards chose this option. Abandoned their posts. Fled west. Tried to outrun the consequences. Karl considered it. Thought about going home. About seeing his wife. About finding Peter if his son had survived the Eastern Front. About leaving Sachsenhausen behind and never speaking of what he had witnessed. It was the sensible choice. The safe choice. The choice that would preserve his own survival. But Karl also thought about the prisoners who were too weak to march. The ones who would be left behind when the camp evacuated. Without guards, without administration, they would be trapped in the compound. Unable to leave. Unable to find food. Potentially dying of starvation before liberation arrived. Karl made his decision. He stayed. When the evacuation began on April 21, Karl was one of 3 guards who remained. Not from loyalty to the Reich. Not from devotion to duty. But from something else. From a recognition that after 2 years of small mercies, he could not abandon the prisoners at the final moment. Could not leave them to die alone. The evacuation columns marched west. 20,000 prisoners in long lines, guarded by SS men who shot anyone who fell behind. Karl watched them leave from Tower 4. Watched the columns disappear into the distance. Watched the camp empty. By evening, only 3,000 prisoners remained. The ones too sick to walk. The ones who had hidden during the evacuation. The ones who had somehow escaped the forced march. They emerged from barracks and hiding places, gathering in the main yard, uncertain what to do with this strange freedom. Karl descended from his tower. Took off his rifle. Placed it on the ground. Walked into the yard where the prisoners gathered. They stared at him. This guard who had remained when all others had fled. This symbol of their captivity who now stood among them without weapons. Without authority. Without the system that had given him power. Someone asked, "Why did you stay?" Karl had no good answer. Said only, someone needed to open the gates when the liberators arrive. And so he waited with them. 3 days. 3 days of strange limbo. The prisoners explored the camp freely. Entered the kitchens. Found food stores that had been locked away. Discovered clothes. Medical supplies. All the things that had been withheld while people died. The abundance revealed made the previous scarcity even more obscene. Karl helped where he could. Showed them where supplies were stored. Opened locked buildings. Provided information about the camp's layout. He was no longer a guard. Was not quite a prisoner. Was something in between. A witness who had chosen to remain for the final act. On April 22, Soviet forces arrived. Tanks rolled through the gates. Soldiers entered the compound. The liberation had arrived. Prisoners wept. Embraced. Collapsed from relief and exhaustion. The war, for them, was finally over. The Soviet commander found Karl in the administration building. Asked who he was. Karl identified himself. Guard. German police officer. Had remained when others evacuated. The commander studied him with hard eyes. Asked why he had stayed. Karl said, to witness. The commander arrested him. Along with the 2 other guards who had remained. They were prisoners now. Held for questioning. For investigation. For determination of what charges might be appropriate. Karl accepted this. Had expected it. Justice required accounting. Required examination of who had participated and how. During interrogation, Karl told the truth. Described his role. Described what he had witnessed. Described his small acts of mercy when asked directly. Did not exaggerate. Did not claim heroism. Simply laid out the facts of his service and let others judge. Some prisoners spoke on his behalf. Remembered the guard in Tower 7 who looked away at crucial moments. Remembered the false alarm that had saved Jacob's life, however briefly. Remembered the small mercies that had accumulated into something that mattered. Not all prisoners. Some remembered only the uniform. Only the system he represented. Their testimony was also valid. The Soviet investigation took weeks. Karl remained in custody. Saw Sachsenhausen from the other side of the barbed wire. Experienced a fraction of what prisoners had endured. It was instructive. Humbling. A reminder that his suffering could never equal theirs. Eventually, Karl was released. Not exonerated. Not celebrated. But determined to have played a complicated role. Guard who had served the system. But also guard who had resisted from within. His actions had saved some lives. Had created moments of humanity in an inhuman place. This was noted. Acknowledged. Considered mitigating. He returned to Dresden. Found his city destroyed by bombing. Found his wife living in a basement. Found that Peter had died on the Eastern Front in March 1945. 1 month before the war ended. 1 month before he might have survived. Karl carried many weights after the war. Grief for his son. Guilt for his service. Knowledge of what he had witnessed. Memory of those he had failed to save. But he also carried something else. The knowledge that he had tried. That he had created small mercies when possible. That he had remained human in a place designed to destroy humanity. The guard who pretended not to see had seen everything. Had witnessed the worst that humans could inflict on each other. But had also witnessed the small acts of resistance. The moments of compassion. The refusal to become entirely what the system demanded. Years later, when asked about his time at Sachsenhausen, Karl would say only this: I was a guard who learned to look away. It was not enough. But it was what I could do. He lived until 1973. Died quietly in Dresden. Left behind no memoirs. No justifications. Only the memories of those he had helped. Only the testimony of prisoners who remembered a guard who sometimes pretended not to see. Who sometimes created space for mercy. Who sometimes, in small ways, resisted. The moral complexity of his role remained unresolved. Guard and rescuer. participant and resistor. Complicit and merciful. Human beings, it turned out, could be all these things simultaneously. Could serve systems of evil while creating pockets of humanity within them. Could fail to save most while saving some. Could witness horror and respond with small acts of courage that mattered precisely because they were small. Precisely because they were possible. The guard who pretended not to see had done both terrible and merciful things. Had witnessed crimes he could not stop. Had created moments of grace he would never discuss. Had learned that resistance could be passive. That courage could be quiet. That humanity could survive in the smallest acts of blindness. In the end, Karl Hoffmann was neither hero nor villain. He was simply a man who had been placed in an impossible situation and had chosen, when he could, to look away. To pretend not to see. To create small spaces where prisoners could breathe. It was not redemption. It was not salvation. But in Sachsenhausen, in that place of organized death, it was something. And sometimes, in the darkest places, something is enough.